Don't be nervous about this sheaf of papers. I'm not going to read out this whole thing, but I will read out the first page because I wanted to get the framing of this story clear in my own mind as much as for you. Sustainability is not a destination like a city of glittering rooftops in the far distance. Rather, sustainability is a system condition in which the system is alive. It is comprised of social and ecological relationships in particular places, each one of which is unique. These relationships are not just between humans. Sustainability is about relationships amongst all of life, not just human life. And seen in this way, the meaning and purpose of sustainable design, which have long been elusive, it's been my life's work to try and understand, if it's possible, what those words mean, that clarity comes into view. With that context, our work, to my satisfaction, is about designing for shared aliveness, an expression from the German philosopher Andreas Weber. Okay, those words are easy to say, but what do they mean in practice? That question, what do I do with this information, is the subject of my talk today, which is about food and agricultural systems. What does design for shared aliveness mean for those living systems? As I mentioned, as I stood up, my talk is not theoretical and it is not speculative. It is not about system conditions that would be nice, perhaps in that glittering city in the far distance. On the contrary, I'm going to focus on places and situations that are happening all around us in different parts of the world and that are already in different ways sustainable. Researchers have given a name, agroecology, to describe these desirable situations and practices. And like so many other buzzwords, agroecology means an awful lot to researchers, but not so much to the farmers who actually do it. A lot of those who practice agroecology would not recognize the word. They use words like natural farming or just farming. So with that introduction, my talk has 5 bits, 5 chapters. The first is, why should anybody care about agroecology? Why does it matter? Secondly, maybe the surprising bit for many of you who are maybe coming from urbanism or built environment backgrounds, that agroecology is, to me, unavoidably urban as well as rural. Thirdly, given that context, what does agroecology need from us? Chapter 4, Agtech and AI, and I hope you don't think I've got you here under false pretenses. I will address directly the potential contribution of technology and AI, but within this framing of social and living systems. And then finally, to redouble my attention to what are we supposed to do, I'm going to say some words about how something called a Shanghai Ecologies Lab could help us all in our different contexts do this kind of work. But first I will show you precisely one slide about what is wrong with the industrial global agricultural system. I have over my life given many talks for hours on end about all the different ways in which agriculture of this kind, industrial, will kill us and the planet. But I just want to use these 3 or 4 statistics to remind us about why we need to support the alternative. Just in terms of energy, this system of massive industrial production, it takes 12 units of energy, the system, for every 1 unit that a human being eats as calories. That's a 12-to-1 ratio of inefficiency applied around the world. It's crazy. In terms of the economy, if you or I go, I'm going to use dollars because that's where the numbers come from, you go into a supermarket and spend $10 on food, at the very most, the farmer who grew that food will get $1, but more likely 50 cents. Again, a gigantic disparity between those people who do the work to create and grow the food and those of us who eat it. There's a whole world of waste and cost that is not enjoyed by the farmer. Third proposition. We all, as Francesca mentioned, biodiversity is the motive force that in many of our different professions and practices is getting us out of bed in the morning. 80% of the biodiversity loss in the world is caused in one way or another by big agriculture and the food systems that it's part of. Final just piece of information to persuade you that we need to pay attention to the alternative. Of all the calories produced by these systems around the world, at the very most, 55% go to feed people, 36% go to feed the animals that maybe we later eat, 9% go to biofuels to run cars and maybe aeroplanes. So that's an insane, nearly half of all the energy that we grow in this so-called agricultural system, we don't benefit from. It goes to other places called the global food economy. So that's why agroecology matters. That is not a sustainable picture, even if it is a gigantic part of the economy. It cannot persist. And so, in answer to my own question, why does agroecology matter, I can tell you the answer in one image and a couple of words. If the well-being of people is important, and if the well-being of nature is determined by the way we look after our world, they are not separate stories. I spent the afternoon with some colleagues on a very beautiful farm an hour from here, where the notion of wellness and well-being and agriculture are being practiced and explored and investigated in one place. But for most of the world economy, the worlds of medicine and caring for illness are in one part of the economy, and the worlds of growing food are somewhere else. This is one of the fundamental reasons why many of us are unwell, either psychologically or physically. That's because we think of them in separate stories. Think of them as one story, and our priorities change in a very profound way, but it does mean profound changes to the way we organize our system. And at this point, I could, and I normally would, continue with a theoretical description about what agricultural means, but I discovered that people quickly turn off. So today, all my examples are going to be bottom-up, in the sense I will tell you about a situation in the world where agroecology exists, and then maybe explain what the kind of strategic framework of that is. And so I'm going to begin with what I believe is one of the most important stories of our age. Those are the words of a celebrated American ecologist called Dr. Didi Pershouse. How many people in this room have heard of the Andra Pradesh community-managed natural farming? Hands up. I would say, are we at 0? 2. So, one of the most important stories of our age for the world, nobody has heard of it, it's not your fault, it just is an unknown story, like many of the examples of that I will tell you about this evening. It has not received attention because it's not part of what most people think is the official narrative of agricultural change. But I will tell you about it. This is a movement in the southern state of India, in Andra Pradesh, which is not so old. It's been going by this name since 2016. In that period, 850,000 farmers, that is small-scale farmers, mostly women, mostly operating in small villages, have made or started the transition from industrial farming to natural farming with the language that they use. That's nearly 1 million small-scale farmers, which none of us has heard of because we don't pay attention. They're organized into 200,000 or more self-help groups. They are organized furthermore by villages. 7,500 villages are involved in this transition movement. 3,370 villages have completed the journey from industrial farming with lots of pesticides and additives to a natural basis one. And one of the ways they've done this is from their own number, they've trained to, at this moment, 10,000 farmer coaches. It's extraordinary as a story of massive change, which we all regard as something we look to for the future, but this is happening now. As a result of this nearly 1 million small-scale farmers making that shift, the results tested by numerous researchers and verified by all sorts of international observers, the soil quality has improved, they don't put a number on it, but dramatically. The water use per farm, per crop, per village has gone down by 50 or 60%, and this is in a very, like many places, water-stressed part of the world. The incomes of these mainly women, who are amongst the poorest people in the world, but their incomes have gone up 2 or 3 times. And in terms of biodiversity, and remember what I said, that the industrial system is the major cause of the loss of biodiversity, with this natural farming, earthworm numbers per unit of soil have gone up 7 times, the number of birds per acre have gone up by 55%, and the number of beneficial insects, pollinators, that without which we will all starve, they have gone up by 60% in that rather short period of time. Which is why, together with others, I call these farmers the true health professionals. So if you remember what I said, that if we think of the health of people and the health of nature as one story rather than 2 stories, then the farmers in Andra Pradesh who are creating healthy food, creating healthy soil, creating healthy biodiversity, they are creating the conditions for health without which we don't have a healthy future. And they get close to 0 credit or recognition for this fact, which is what I'm here to do tonight, about other things. And this image inspires me every time I see it, because I don't know how many of you, if any, have been involved in different aspects of agriculture or food design or food reform. It's overwhelmingly a world of people like me, with large white men for the most part. And what you see in this picture, so on the left of the picture, or left 2/3, are the presidents of companies, the ministers from the government, the civil society leaders, the professors, all the people who have for the last 100 years been the experts in what has to happen to food or what has to happen to agriculture. They are being briefed by these women on the right with amazement and wonder and joy in many cases about a story that most of them had not heard about either, but in which a self-help movement from the very bottom upwards has achieved these incredible results. And they are, therefore, the true transformation agents for me and for many others, these women with no recognition and no visibility in the rest of the world. In India alone, there are 100 million women participate in self-help groups to do with their employment, much of it to do with the land. They teach each other. They learn from what they do, they teach each other, and they then learn about what they can do better amongst themselves all the time. They don't go to colleges at all, for the most part, but they learn every day on the job from each other. And each village has a kind of collective commitment to transformation. So this is the most important story none of you have heard of before, and is what, to me, it describes agroecology, which is the kind of subject of my talk this evening. And so it's happening there. It's happening in many other places on a smaller scale. I am not describing a sort of fantastical or idealized future. So the question arises, great, it's happening in Andhra Pradesh. How do we multiply that in the language of technology? How do we scale it up? And again, I want to read out these words from Dr. Pershouse, because for all of us, this notion of if you have a good idea or a good solution, you want to multiply it around the world. She says that's probably the wrong way to think about it. Rather than ask, how do we scale regenerative agriculture, she says, I prefer to ask, in this unique place and living system, where is the next intervention point that could change everything? In other words, looking for the uniqueness of each situation, and all our situations are unique. How can we intervene in what is a social and ecological system which is alive and always changing? What small actions can we take that can trigger it to a different condition? What then happens, and I've described directly from the field, so to speak, what is happening, is that people have said we must summarize this in a picture. And this is one of the many pictures that have been made by researchers and by communicators, people like me, in this case a kind of constellation of the qualities of agroecology, the things that you find in an abstract sense explain what makes it different from industrial agriculture. And I'm showing it to you because I'm not a fan of clouds of symbols, because I think they quickly become hard to comprehend, but they do remind us that we're talking about a complex system with social and ecological actors together. So that is, it's complex, it's social, but if we lose those things and put them to one side because it's inconvenient, then we fail to understand the nature of the opportunity before us. And so this is to summarize my section on why agroecology matters. Those 5 sort of words down there are words from the world of policy, from Chinese government priorities, from the European Union, where I'm from. We all have the same concern with these kind of abstract ideas: food security, public health and well-being, biodiversity, social reweaving, rural revitalization. You can pick up any newspaper and see those words every day, but for most of us, I think they remain words. And my proposition to you is, if those are the objectives that your society or your family or your company or your university decides to make a priority, they are achieved through the medium of agroecology. It's an important, if hard to grasp, point, but just because I want to make a connection this evening between my descriptive work of something happening in another country to the things that you will read in your newspapers every day. This brings me to part 2. Agroecology is not just about small-scale farmers in India, or for that matter in China, where you have 300 million small-scale farmers. Is anybody here from a farming family or background? Some people, yeah, a small number. Most of us live in cities in different degrees of isolation from where our food comes from, so we're not special or different. But the point is, most of us, when we see the word agroecology, say, oh, this is to do with natural farming in the countryside. No. My second and important point tonight is that if we want to have healthy cities, if we want to be well in our cities, then our cities should be suffused and shaped by agroecology as much as farmers in some other part of our daily lives. And it's not just about being nice to the nature. Cities are actually where quite a large chunk of our food comes from. So the US Department of Agriculture, which if anybody knows about such things is a pretty conservative and hard-bitten organization at the best of times, even they have acknowledged, after rather extensive research, that between 15 and 20% of global food eaten by humans is produced in urban and peri-urban environments. So that's nearly a fifth of all the food that keeps people alive. So when you read about food security or food sovereignty as a national mission, which it is in China, and for that matter also in Europe, then think about food coming from cities is 1/5 of that objective of food security. More or less 0% of policymakers and 0% of agricultural experts think about that, because the overwhelming majority of urban food comes from non-industrial, small-scale and very fragmented sources, as I will show you. But there are 2 sources for those of you who want to say, this guy cannot be serious. How can 1/5 of the world's food come from cities? There's a couple of publications that you, I think, would find valuable. On the left is a new book out a couple of weeks ago called Urban Food Mapping, which tells you about all the different cities around the world in which food is grown and how it's organized. And on the right is one of the world's most, it's a bit like the women farmers in Andra, Pradesh, unknown organization filled with valuable knowledge called RUAF. They have a magazine called Urban Agriculture, and you can get the magazine online. I think it's probably free if you're in the institution, which is all about how cities are beginning to pay attention to urban agriculture and the kind of consequences for urban planning, urban design, urban strategies for taking urban agriculture seriously. One of the examples in the book, which might be surprising, is this picture of Dallas, Texas. That's Texas of oilmen, longhorn cattle, and somewhat conservative behaviors. This is Dallas, Texas, taking seriously the notion that in this 110-acre location, in the a troubled but central area, they are making serious attempts to organize agricultural growing in Dallas, Texas, on a serious basis. You obviously can't read all the words. You can look up these things online. The point is to see that what looks like might be a shopping centre or a car park or an airport, that is a large-scale agricultural intervention into a city which totally has zero reputation for being a particularly green one. The book and other sources contain other cities around the world, many of them, all of which are achieving sort of self-awareness and surprising themselves by the amount of urban agriculture that's already happening. On the left is Atlanta, Georgia, a bit like Texas, by no stretch of the imagination a progressive or green or liberal city. But when they started to analyze and research, walking around and looking with their own eyes and ears and noses, they found all those yellow dots represent, in one way or another, significant sites of urban agriculture. And on the right, the green bits, and maybe not so visible in Taipei. Again, so many sites of urban food growing, it just amazes everybody once you start to look. This is in Amsterdam, which I lived in for 12 years, and a friend of mine called Deborah Solomon, you can see her with the white hair there, is working with the city and the municipal authorities on surveying all the unused spaces in Amsterdam that are just sitting there with badly kept municipal gardens, and step by step planning for organised urban farming interventions, which, like in every other city that you could imagine, there are always spaces. But I just want to show you, this is a designed situation, this farm, and most of them, designed with the communities, with the people who know about food growing, lots of different disciplines. The point is that just 10 years ago, it would have been unheard of to see a major European kind of high-tech city like Amsterdam embracing such a subject. Well, my favorite example is Berlin. Has anybody here been to Berlin? Yeah, a few people. So Berlin is like an epitome. It's a very big, very important capital of Germany, large industrial city, one of the heartlands of the German industrial system. Berlin is more or less seriously contemplating what it would mean to take seriously the notion of Berlin as a farm. What on earth does that mean? Well, they discovered by researching, as the other cities have done, where food is being processed or grown already, that the number of places where food is happening is far more than they realized. Then what's happening is that the planners who are, you've heard of the notion of a 15-minute city, where you should be able to access all the services that you need. They've overlaid the notion of a 15-minute city onto this map of food places and saying, where are the gaps? Where in Berlin can you not reach a food-growing site, a garden or a communal kitchen or an edible forest within 15 minutes? And they made a map, and they've discovered that they can identify where there are gaps, where there needs to be. In general, what they do is put a food hub where there's a gap. So this is where you think of infrastructure not as roads or tunnels or lay-bys, but as food hubs around a city in which the hubs they connect together all those little green dots, and you get a network, a little bit like a sort of a slime mold covering the city. Now, if there's anybody here from the real estate business or architecture or design, you're probably thinking, the last thing that I want to see is some messy farm near to my beautiful design project or my city hall or my shopping mall. The research coming out of Europe, I can't speak for China, it's probably not the same, but in Europe they are discovering that having an apartment or somewhere a place to live which is physically adjacent to a farm or a community garden adds up to 20% of the value per square metre to that flat, which is completely against what every normal architect or town planner has thought until recently. People want to be near living things. They want to be near people working with living things. They want to be near things that they can eat. And in all those senses, that's what is discovering that shapes the desirability of different places for the inhabitants of Berlin. It's beginning to shape new build. I don't have a lot of interest in the subject of building new towns because in general, as you know, in China, we have enough buildings. We don't need many new ones. But it is the case that this notion of agriculture and urbanism making desirable urban development is happening on an increasing scale. This is in a Dutch town called Oosterwald, the architecture firm working with the municipality, in which each house has access to a certain number of square meters of well-tended and fertile ground. And there are many dozens of the projects of that kind. We have a real estate crisis in Europe like you do here, so I'm not suggesting that this is some big part of the picture, but it's an important part of the signal of change of cities seeing green things and growing as a signal of their own health and well-being, which is frankly not what it was like before. And you're seeing what does happen with more speed than new build, like that village in Holland, is repurposing oil age infrastructure or car age infrastructure. So there are many tens, hundreds of thousands of abandoned gasoline stations in Europe, which have, in many cases, rather good locations relative to where people live or move around. Many of these are being repurposed. The thing that works best, if the soil isn't damaged, is to have a small garden or a small edible forest or a small food processing facility that is owned and operated by the community. That's a kind of rather cheap way to increase the quality of a location. This is the biggest urban farm in Paris. I live in France. That was once a kind of transport interchange with car parking, garages and other mobility era things. Paris is a pretty advanced city. Now that has become a massive urban farm, and it's far, far cheaper than building concrete infrastructure or the things that we used to call that. And I said earlier that what has this got to do with, the manager of a city? The evidence is overwhelming in all these different examples that the presence of urban ecology enables this word social reweaving. I don't know if I've got the Chinese translation correct there, but that's a kind of policy. We have fractured communities. People are very badly socially isolated, particularly after COVID or in overdevelopment. All around the world, people suffer from stress of all kinds. The presence of the possibility to share the growing and the production of food is probably the most effective way of creating social value and social contact that we know about. And all policymakers say, this sounds nice, but give me the numbers. The numbers are there. If you now look the last 5 years, you can now demonstrate that this creates social value as well as production value. So as I promised, I'm jumping through all these bits of paper, but we had to... So social reweaving, is that a correct Chinese word? Do you understand what I mean by social reweaving? Creating social contact where they've been disappeared or broken by modernity, modernization, COVID and so on. Anyway, so we use the word a bit in Europe. It is how you create social solidarity where it has been lost and missing. So if it's not a garden, it can be one of these kitchen incubators, which are in different parts of the world, social participation in preparing food, experimenting with it and so on. Sites of learning, sites of meeting new people, sites of learning to connect with people who are otherwise isolated and so on. I guess the words speak for themselves. And certainly in China, my experience here, my special subject, if you like, at Tongji and with my colleagues, is this subject of urban-rural reconnection. So if you don't pick up a piece of newspaper saying rural revitalization, you're probably reading a foreign newspaper. It's a huge subject here. It's not so clearly evident in Europe, but certainly in the United States, the big political turmoil, a large part of it is because rural communities have been ignored and treated badly for so many generations. Everybody wants to do rural revitalization, but for the most part it's kind of regarded as a separate subject, giving money to some distant community for building a football field or getting money for a bus stop or whatever. What we've discovered in our investigations here in China and elsewhere is that it doesn't make sense to think of rural and urban as separate places. We all want to be connected to rural situations, even if we aren't through our families or our histories. Most urban people feel a gap, a missing element in their lives of not being close to and involved with the land. And so the design of different ways for people to be living in cities and rural is a gigantic opportunity for anybody who wants to look at that subject. Again, with the visit we did this afternoon, was about exactly this phenomenon of a kind of rural farm campus, more or less within the city limits of Shanghai, in which it feels like being in the countryside, but you're in the city. And there's a whole pile of questions about how do you design being there, what type of inhabitants, what kind of living does it mean to be in a kind of rural situation in the city. This is for comfortable rich people in general, I have to say, but around the world, how do we enable poor people who have demanding jobs, families that have to work 10, 12, 18 hours a day to survive? How do those people too have access to rural situations? If not on a full-time basis, then on a part-time basis. There's a huge world of service design, shared housing, shared accommodation, shared tourism that are emerging, and we did that, and I'll mention that again a bit later. But supposing that, I hope I persuaded you, and if I haven't persuaded you, then I apologize, but supposing that you agree, yes, actually it's a good idea if cities have more things growing in them, not just parks for sitting in, but food growing, then we need to care for the soil. So the soil care in cities sounds like a far-fetched and unexpected subject. This is Shenzhen. I don't know why I have to keep knocking the thing. This is Shenzhen, which is one of them, I guess it's the most unlikely place in China where you would have people contemplating soil care. But all over the world, the big metropolitan centres, if you talk to people about soil care, they look at you blankly or say you're in some kind of dreamer or hippie. What I want to say is that that is changing too. There are people in unlikely situations looking at cities and saying, you're right, not to me, but to each other. We do need to care for the soil in our cities, not just a moral duty, but practically because we want our cities to be healthier. If we want to have healthy cities, we need to have healthy soil. There is no argument about that. My picture is a city in the north of Europe where a German ecologist called Lebens has been working since 2020 on a strategy and practical experiments in about the most damaged formerly industrial environment that you can imagine. So this that you see are literally mines and steel processing plants, you see railway junctions, you see generations of industrial kind of apparatus added to this city centre. The city is now a kind of Rust Belt city, European version. But what Professor Lebens is doing is saying, even here, if you go into the detail of this city, you will find plants, you will find microbes, you will find soils, you will find the effects of climate, you will discover about geology and how that influenced the evolution of that city, and of course you will find people. And those plants, microbes, soils, climate, geology and people, they are the actors in caring for the soil in an urban context. And to keep it simple, and I checked whether you'd eaten beforehand, what soil needs is not so different from what human being needs. Soil needs food, water and air to survive and to be healthy. So you may ask, where does urban soil get its food from? Not so many people have been worrying about that, it has to be said. But actually, cities are filled with potential food for soil in the form of the food waste that, as you may know a bit better, is a huge issue in many places. I think that in Hong Kong it's 5,000 kilos a day. I don't know what is the figure for Shanghai, somebody will know for certain. Tens of thousands of kilos of food are just thrown it away or become a kind of management problem to be trashed, whereas food is waste is food for soil. What is missing is some system whereby the food waste can be turned into food that the soil can readily ingest. So, of course, I'm not describing a blank sheet of paper here. All over the world, people are inventing urban food composting systems in which, in a multitude of different ways, people go to where the food waste is about to be thrown in the trash, collect it, take it to a composting centre, a treatment centre, a processing centre, and they do lots of different things. And every culture in the world has different ways of turning food waste into compost. The details don't matter. The point is, this is a system needing to be designed, needing to be optimized, because so much, in most cities, 2 or 3% at the very most of their food waste is turned into compost for the city's soils. A gigantic opportunity in terms of giving health to the city. Food waste systems are pretty near the top of that. And so, just as an example of where it's happening, where it wasn't happening before, I was in India recently, and in the city of Chennai, there's a rather miraculous service called Kabadiwala Connect, started by a data scientist. So how many people here are data scientists or would consider themselves that? Oh, none. You're a data scientist. Francesco has just become a data scientist. This guy is a data scientist, now becomes the designer of a waste management network using all sorts of different technologies and information systems to design a world in which all the informal people who collect waste from the city collect it together in an organized way, get paid for doing so, and so on. It's too complicated a story for me to explain in detail. The point is that this guy was voted the Entrepreneur of the Year in India for using the techniques of data, of machine learning, service design, and social justice, bringing them together in a system for collecting trash and waste. And the kind of work involved in a city-wide or region-wide system, it involves mapping the flows of resources. It means turning the information that you get from studying the flow into digital information. It means sourcing, connecting together the people who have food waste with the people who process it and so on. And it means organizing at a municipal scale so that you don't overlap with, but you coordinate with existing, for example, waste services. It's actually extremely complicated, but a lot of it's become possible because of two things. Municipal authorities now want increasingly to make their cities healthier, and therefore the health of the soil is for the first time, a priority. And secondly, because there are the skills of people like data scientists looking at informal economies and bringing new forms of organization to their story. And there is a technology side. So I don't know if anybody in Tongji University with your millions of very smart engineers is working on compost, but if they're not, you're in competition with MIT. What you see there is an experiment by MIT in conjunction with an organization called FarmHack, which is all about measuring the temperature of an urban compost heap on a real-time basis, because, as you may or may not know, compost needs to be looked after, it needs to be cared for. If it gets too hot, it doesn't do well if it gets too dry. So these sensors tell somebody who's responsible for the compost heap, is it too wet, is it too dry, is it too hot? And then they can go and add water or turn it or whatever. So it's Internet of Things, machine learning, a bit of lots of things, a service organization, all applied to compost. Part 3, I'm sort of on time. I realized looking at this that I've almost, in that last sequence, begun to answer my question. But my question is, supposing that I've half persuaded you that agriculture, agroecology is an important part of all our lives if we're going to be healthy, if we think that the well-being of people and the well-being of nature is something we care about, then we need to care about agroecology also. But rather than sitting in a lecture theatre or in a studio or kind of in a darkened studio and saying, well, what can I do to help agroecology? I think it's actually more productive to ask, what does agroecology need from us? What can we learn by talking to the practitioners about what it needs from us? And that's part 3 of my talk. And I've mentioned these words before, that the whole answer to my question is on this slide. What agroecology needs from us is for us to shift our attention, if we are involved in food or agriculture, away from a concern with calories, crops and commodities, which is the units of measurement of the global system, towards the health of social, ecological living systems. So in other words, if you want to be involved in the success of agroecology, you're going to have to get involved in systems thinking and design, ecology, social design, and a whole bunch of other things. It's not just about good intentions or feeling virtuous. Intervening in, as I said at the beginning, intervening in a system which is filled with people and nature and natural systems is not an easy thing to do. Very few of us have been taught it. The people who know most about it are those women in India that I showed you at the beginning, who are farmers and for generations have been farmers. The rest of us, living in a world of abstraction and data and machines and distance from living things, for us, we have a harder job to do. But I think this is where the question of values becomes evident, in which those women know what I'm about to tell you because they experience it every day, but the rest of us do things like reading books. So this statement by the famous scientist Fritjof Capra kind of is the statement of changing values that I think maybe frames what I think agroecology is asking from us. It's asking us to accept that all living beings are members of ecological communities bound together in a network of interdependencies. That's what agroecology is asking from us. And you may say, okay, very nice words, but what do they mean? I come back to the slide I've shown you before, and I'll probably show it to you one more time, that those words are causing us, whatever our work and practice, wherever we're living and whatever we're doing, to try in lots of different ways to remove this separation between the health of our body, the health of our world, the health of our family, to connect together and to form relationships wherever we can. There's one sense in which those words from Fritjof Capra are a challenge, which is that supposing that we're now going to look after all of life and not just human life, 99% of life in the world is invisible. Oh, what? What do you mean? We're all here, lots of people are filling up this room. That's because 99% of the life in the world is bacterial in one sense or another. And so when we think about looking after all of life and not just human life, this includes the different scales of activity that one could join or contemplate, from the microbiome, that is tiny, tiny little spots of life in a city street, through to the bioregion. We have to be aware of the different scales at which life operates, because where life operates, humans are affected because we are part of it. And the three words down there they're kind of scientific, well, they're not buzzwords, they're just technical words about where people who are concerned with urban agroecology look, where they're busy, the researchers and the scientists. The rhizosphere is the world of soils and roots. There's a lot of that. The phyllosphere, is all the surfaces of all the plants above ground. So if you imagine just walking around any street, you see the plants, the trees, the bushes, the flowers. On the surfaces of all those leaves, all those uncountable leaves, there are bacterial communities and all sorts of life. If we are concerned with the health of a city, we need to at least know people who know about that subject. And the hydrosphere is perhaps easiest to guess, that's water and the life in water. Coming back to Meulemans and his work, he discovered the importance of bacterial life in restoring the soils of his Belgian city by meeting bacteriologists who said, by the way, there are bacteria that can help you make this soil healthier. And China is a global leader in historical expertise in, for example, phytoremediation, or different ways in which plants and other life forms can help remove toxins from the soil. But all this knowledge is now coming together in a pretty remarkable transformation of how we think about healthy cities. So this is one of the professors in a conference 1 month ago called Probiotic Cities, Professor Sun from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is her visualization of all the places in a city where one could conceivably look at bacterial life and say, can we make bacterial life here healthier rather than unhealthy? And it's a kind of to-do list, which is, if you look at all closely, you can see this later, or it's online, this image is published in Nature. it's a pretty amazing prospect when you consider normally what you see as abstract pictures of buildings and all sorts of data to do with building performance, which covers more or less everything except bacterial vitality. There are other people, research groups, looking at bacterial quality inside buildings. This is a bit more mature. So there are people looking at forms of lighting, forms of air conditioning, forms of heating and ventilation, and so on. These are not mature technologies, but there's a great deal of knowledge about that living things can do the job of machines in a more and more surprisingly large number of ways. So that's kind of happening. The construction industry is interested because they want to be green, but they suddenly discovered that they can achieve through plants what they could otherwise have to use through installing, hence heating and ventilating systems. And it's all, excuse me, it all comes together in this new word, a couple of years old, microbiome-inspired green infrastructure, or MIGI. A group of researchers in many different countries have taken these different discoveries and say, my goodness, if we want our cities to be well and healthy, then with their bacterial life absolutely needs to be thought of as part of the infrastructure of the city. We need to get our act together on what we can do to improve the bacterial health ecosystems of our urban context. Again, we have the vegetation, if you remember, the phylosphere, as well as the microbial life that is invisible to us. How all that's going to be turned into practice is kind of happening more or less right now. And so, yes, of course, architects and designers are involved in that, but they're all discovering very quickly that without biologists, without entomologists, without a whole raft of other scientific skills, you cannot make much progress. But in MIGI, as a sort of field of work in cities, is probably the most transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work you can imagine. It's fantastically entertaining and fun, but check it out. Part 4, I'm going to be running 5 minutes over, I can tell you that in advance, but that's okay. The poster at the beginning said, Agritech for Agroecology. I wanted to, make sure that in an engineering and technology and science super institution like this, at least some of you would come. But it is true that there is a complete boom in interest in the worlds of tech in the subject of agriculture. This is from just one of the global trade fairs and conferences that are happening around the world. I discovered that last year in 2023, just in China, there were 5,500 ag tech startups. Now that's a hell of a lot of startups, and it denotes two things. One is a certain understanding on the part of engineers and developers and entrepreneurs about the sheer size of the world of agriculture, that if food is eaten by every human being on the planet, it's a more or less unlimited market. But the second thing it denotes is an assumption, an expectation that nobody could really want to be a farmer if they had a choice. Nobody would want to work on the land if they had a choice. We must automate it. We must make it possible to work remotely. We must save the farmer from his or her fate of being forced to work with agriculture and soil. It's a kind of coherent story if you come from the world of tech and you have never met or worked with farming communities. If you have worked with farming communities, you will know that these assumptions are wildly misplaced and just a whole world of assumptions that don't correspond to the reality and the evidence of people's lived experience. And you see it everywhere. The signs of the problems that this creates is a misallocation of resources on a rather gigantic scale. So on the right is a kind of representative picture of what the ag-tech world imagines, that you have some kind of dashboard or joystick or navigator which enables you to sort of steer your farm from somewhere else than the farm itself. And on the right, you could actually see this in DNI, Tongji at the moment, is a similar looking picture about the urban planning of the future. The notion of you're standing back from the thing. You're dealing with images and abstraction and data in isolation from lived experience. They're very common to both stories. The thing that is missing from the left-hand story, which is a state of the art. It says AI augmented planning, urban observatory. I mean, I love MIT, but let's face it, they are behind the times. On that circle of functions and activities, there is no mention at all of food, agriculture, greenery, microbiomes or anything. It's just about buildings, traffic data and so on, the usual kit. It is a kind of a criticism because at this stage of things you'd think they would have noticed that. My point is that the ag-tech boom is based on this very limited and very partial understanding of what agroecology needs. And I, of course, I'm not a farmer, so I suddenly reminded myself I need to talk to the people who are doing it to find out, is it true that agroecology is against tech? Is it true that small-scale farmers don't need software or don't need devices? And I discovered this rather wonderful world called the Grassroots Technological Innovation Network, which met for the first time last year. And it is basically all the organizations and networks that I've ever heard of, and many that I've not heard of, that in different parts of the world from radically different contexts represent or are by small farmers themselves. This picture, if you're interested, is a very good research gateway if you want to learn about who is doing agroecology and where they are and what they have to say about it. What they have done since this assembly last year is make a series of very simple announcements about what they think they need from technology. They include this group called Indigenous AI Working Group. So the women that I talked about from the south of India are from a caste which is regarded as a separate and isolated part of Indian society. And all over the world, very often, the people who know most about land are the people who live on it and work on it, the poorest of the poor, from our perspective. But now we're beginning to understand that indigenous peoples have knowledge and experience and lived embodied experience that we need to know about if we're going to make wise judgments and take wise actions with the land. So they are part of the community saying, we are not against technology, but we are against some lab in a city making assumptions about what we need. We need to be part of and to drive the innovation agenda, not to be the recipients of things that may not be what we need. I thought I'd show a picture to calm your nerves. If you're coming from the world of AI, I am not saying we must get rid of all of the gigantic attention paid to machine learning and AI, but to think of them as adjacent and overlapping and interacting universes in which soil wisdom and worm learning is as important as machine learning, not as an alternative, but if we're going to have a healthy and responsible notion of soil, we have to have both. And I'll let you watch the worms whilst I look for this statement that I wanted to read out. I think I'll keep going because otherwise I'm going to run a bit late. You get the picture. What these groups in their discussions concluded was that no, not that they are against AI or against automation or against apps or anything like that, but that they need to be part of and leaders of the agenda for priorities. And in terms of machine learning and AI, these four subjects are what they concluded would be their priorities if given the opportunity to shape the agenda. Yes, Earth observation and using AI to analyze gigantic quantities of data is useful, but the kind of analysis that is done by farmers deciding what kind of information they need, not by satellite operators or mineral prospectors or whatever. So yes, Earth observation is valuable, but it needs to be observing and interpreting data according to what the farmers need. I think I'm just going to read these out because I can't talk. These are all a lecture by themselves, but compressing space and time, all ways in which people can localize resources is an AI potential. Mobilizing local knowledge is an AI potential, and reconnecting man to nature. Those four were the words I put in the box, overlaid on a gigantic report that came out 2 years ago, where all the machine learning giant companies got together and in a public-spirited way say, here are all the tools and techniques that we know about that could be, in their language, saving climate and saving climate science. It's not that they were wrong, it's just that they were absolutely, without exception, talking from the perspective of technology, not from the perspective of people living on and stewarding the land. And the opportunity that I do think is something we could explore, and I know in my final point I'm just coming to, AI can be an instrument for reconnecting us to the realization that we are connected to all of nature, that we tend to kind of forget in machine learning and digital twins and these very beautiful, clean, but lifeless environments. We need to be prompted all the time to look for the crucial piece of information about what makes a living ecosystem healthy is the quality of the relationships between the people or the insects or the aphids inside it. So this imagery on the left is from a famous ecologist called Jane Memmott, who's revolutionized our understanding about ecosystem health by her study of relational health rather than just lists of who is there or who is missing. With AI, you can start to measure and analyze and get signals of opportunity or corrections when an ecosystem is lacking in this relational energy. And the other thing which I love very much in terms of reconnecting us to the realization that nature is alive, this is an ecologist called Julian Lieber who uses a combination of visualization techniques and machine learning to replicate the movement of hi-fi through the floor of a forest. So on the left there you can see a bunch of what I've all my life until 2 years ago regarded as dead leaves. Now, since I saw this visualization of the microbial hi-fi that goes through those leaves looking for nutrition and for information, I can no longer be in a forest and not realize that it's alive. That is why a scientific visualization triggered an understanding in me that an indigenous person or a forest dweller or a forest worker would always have known instinctively. And it's me explaining it's not about science and visualization and AI being opposites, but they can reinforce patterns of learning that need to be a priority. And indigenous knowledge is, but I want to come on to the final part, which is this notion of AI is valuable insofar as we can have a dialogue with it about the information that it is processing and sharing with us. I think you presumably know about this notion of contestable AI. It's a big subject in health, in biomedical health. It's not at all yet prominent in the world of caring for soil or caring for a forest. But think of it that way, that if we could amplify to a degree that give voice to nature, give voice to natural systems, with AI, so to speak, as an intermediary, how much richer our understanding and relationships would be. And of course, this is something which has already been prototyped in different places. This is in Portugal, a project called EdenX. Some artists and technologists have created the kind of an interface between human beings and living systems, in which prompts are coming to the discussion called, for example, about law. Should this river have rights? Should this factory be allowed to take water out of the river? It's a kind of prompted dialogue environment in which natural living systems are represented on a screen, but the actual discourse between you and the natural living system is not entirely artificial, because the AI is looking around for all the different conversations that are being had about the rights of rivers and turning that information into a dialogue that you can have. It's a complicated subject to explain quickly, but check out EdenX, because the notion of AI as an intermediary with subjects such as the law, I think, is where its single most important potential is going to be. I've done an hour, but I'm going to have 5 more minutes to wrap this up, because I promised at the beginning that I would talk about the most important question of all, which is that if it's important or even interesting what I've told you, what practically can be done about it? What is the connection, if any, between man-made internet, human creation, artificial intelligence, technology on the one side, and nature's internet on the other? Are they fated to remain apart, or is there something practical that we can do to combine these two worlds in ways that make the world a healthier place? And I want to come to remind you of what I said at the beginning, the things that make agroecology important, and to explain what we can practically do. Agroecology enables food security. Agroecology is a medium of social reweaving. Agroecology enables urban-rural vitalization. Those things we all want. I don't think, unless you don't want them, and I can't help you. But if you do want them, you need to know about how to bring agroecology into the equation. The only small problem is that agroecology is a living social ecological system, and to my mind, nobody in the world has been taught how to design in that or how to do it. So that's our starting point. But as I did at the beginning with the farmers from Andra, Pradesh, I'm going to answer my question by examples of places in the world, 3, where people are now today engaging with relationships with social ecological systems. Launched last week, Living Infrastructures is a platform in Los Angeles, which, as you can see on the words below, is a whole systems approach to watershed health. Whole systems, geological systems, hydrological systems, human systems. Los Angeles, as you presumably know, is one of the great conurbations in the world, paved surfaces, millions of cars, generations of mistreatment of water. But do they either say, okay, we give in, we're going to die of water stress, or is there some way we can intervene in this situation? And the infrastructure that I'm showing you is basically an interface to a pretty remarkable piece of research over the last 3 years of bringing together knowledge in more than 60 different data layers about what's happening in the Los Angeles County watershed that could be part of any solution or action or intervening in that situation. So the words down the right are just a selection of the data layers that the designers in California have come up with, ranging from community gardens that I've talked about today, cooling centres, indigenous territories. It's quite amazing, the complexity, but also how easy it is to go into this environment and start to find out what is the kind of subject that we're talking about here. A couple of examples. This is a map, one of those 60 data layers, which is showing in real time the information that people have about flooding, and not just in general terms about flooding in the Los Angeles areas, but street by street and almost house by house. So that if you imagine there's a whole variety of things one could do, such as planting ditches or rain gardens to absorb water when it falls, how powerful it is to see in the city of Los Angeles the locations rather precisely identified from research where one should put the rain garden, do the dike or whatever. It's an extraordinary sort of way to make the decisions that people take wiser and more appropriate, rather than saying, okay, we must plant 1 trillion trees. That's not the answer. The answer is to know your place very deeply. Here's a second example from the infrastructure. This is looking at a sort of subsection of the greater Los Angeles area and saying, what are the things that we might do given that this particular place is a flood risk? And on the left are all the different things ranging from, a drinking fountain, installing a light, different sorts of bioswales and so on. And so you get individual tiny actions you could just take in your garden on the left. And on the right are data, and this is to me a bit of a miracle, about is this cost effective, is this biologically and biodiversity effective, and so on. It gives you wise data to make a decision as an individual or a community about what should you do if the system has told you that your street is a flood risk. And then the third one, which I think has just blown my mind more than any of them really, is this one which gives you, through this same interface, access to the geological and biodiversity history of the Los Angeles County through history. What used to grow here before it was built, before human habitation, before the white man came and trashed the place. Knowing what did grow there is a very important guide, not that you then reproduce that, but it gives you very powerful knowledge about what kinds of living systems one could bring into that situation. So that's the living infrastructure. I'm going to just go into the next one. In Hong Kong, I talked about soil care. There's a soil trust run by professors and students from Hong Kong Polytechnic, not so different from this school, in which they are in real getting their hands and feet and minds dirty with how to create one of those compost systems that I talked about earlier, turning food waste, in this case through bokashi, into compost for the gardens and the soils of Hong Kong. It's a complicated story, but a very beautiful one in which students of all different subjects are learning by doing what it means to make a composting system that works. And so the knowledge they get about designing one system for one location on one farm is something they can take back to their communities around the world. And there are some compost design service experts from Hong Kong, not so far from here. I don't know really why that could not be you, if that's something that you wanted to know, so check out their work. And then finally, from my own hometown, not my town, from where I live in France, a mountainous area, a project to do with regenerative hydrology in the Cevennes area of France, where, like many places in the world, we have a problem with too much rain in the wrong places at the wrong time. There were big riots and political crisis in France to do with agribusiness building gigantic industrial reservoirs to collect all the rain and feed gigantic wheat fields that they then export as exports. In this place, we want to know how can we collect rain in a mountain to support small-scale agriculture in a way that is kind to the mountain, kind to the planting, and kind to the farmers. Therefore, to answer that question, you have people from diverse backgrounds, an ecologist, a scientist, a civil engineer, a water engineer, and a municipal official on the hillside itself, saying where can we build the possibility to retain rainwater that's appropriate to this place, appropriate to the mountain, appropriate to the practices of agriculture. They are already working with volunteers, physically moving rocks from one place to another that are unique to that place to create barriers to save the water. And this is to just illustrate the amount of detail required to do that work. The notion of global solutions, the point of this story and all my stories, is that global solutions more or less do not exist. Global solutions exist for industrial agriculture, but that's why they've created the monster that we're trying to replace. So what the lab would do, to conclude, is draw on histories that already exist. So my colleagues, long before I came onto the scene, for 17 years now, people around this university have been involved in projects of the kind I just described. Design Harvests is a kind of sequence of activities of design people interacting in rural situations. There was a whole festival about urban-rural reconnection, developing urban-rural relations just 4 years ago that I was involved with in the context of this big exhibition called Urban Rural, which brought together 100+ projects from this region and internationally. Like I've told you in my talk, examples of people doing it rather than just talking about it. And there are people right now, today, in Francesca's lab and people around who are mapping the wetlands of Shanghai, reconnecting through knowledge and mapping and different artistic practices with these forms of life that we've until now taken for granted or ignored. I'm putting this in here because the most arcane piece of information I discovered, I know the people involved are here tonight. The chemometer is an ancient Chinese wisdom and knowledge of the land transposed into a context of an agricultural living system in transition. And Dr. Johnson, who's here from her group at the Lijiang studio, do exactly what people in other places of the world. They go to the places, they learn about the places, they embodied experience of the places. Yes, they have scientific trainings, yes, they are artists, yes, they're whatever, but being in the place and of the place is pretty central to the qualities that I'm talking about tonight. We have groups of researchers who are ready and waiting to do this work. I think many of you are similar. We have a SustainX group that is looking for ways to turn the concept of complex social ecological systems as a theoretical idea into a practice. I hope I've shown you examples of the practice tonight, and that the words that I've used are no longer something for outside this environment, that nature connection, living infrastructures, dashboards for urban ecology, and the replication of this work and knowledge with other cities is where our future belongs. Thank you for your attention.